what do you think of the curriculum that you teach? Because history is weird in that some people feel like we don't delve into enough depth for certain topics.
I mean,
and we gloss
California
over
is
things.
definitely more progressive than other states, obviously, on, at least the freedom that teachers get and the standards that they should hit. There's definitely been a lot of public talk lately and a lot of pushback, especially with like the Black Lives Matter movement and talking about systematic racism and various different projects. Like the New York Times came out with that 1619 project, which is all about the idea that we should start looking at U.S. history from the year 1619, which is when the first slaves came to the United States, and kind of looking at how slavery has molded the way that the United States developed, and looking at how basically the United States was developed on these systems of slavery and systematic racism. And being able to teach things like that in school is, in California, we're definitely more progressive and we're more accepting of talking about these issues and addressing them and, proposing anti-racist curriculum. But in a lot of other states, like I saw, oh God, I think he was from Missouri maybe, but like they were talking about it on the floor of the Senate, and he was like, the 1619 curriculum should not be considered. It should not be part of our curriculum. It should not be taught,
Well, it's not backed, right? There are a lot of prominent historians who say that there's no basis for it, that a lot of what they're saying is just radical activism, that they're just trying to push a narrative.
It's pretty historical fact that this country was built on the back of slaves. I mean,
but every country, every nation has been built on the back of slavery. Not necessarily the slavery that we think of where it's, white and black, but slavery is not a unique invention.
No.
And it's been going on long before America was around.
Yeah, but in the modern sense, and especially in like Eurocentric history, where like, we're focusing on European populations, like, Europeans coming to the United States and establishing colonies, the Spaniards coming to South America and establishing colonies, etc. Those countries were built on the backs of slavery, of people that were taken from their homes in Africa and told that they had to work here to make us rich.
Is that what the 1619 project? I'll be honest, I don't know.
Yeah, that's like basically the basis of it. That like you should start looking at U.S. history in 1619 when the first slaves were brought there, and you should look at U.S. history through the lens of Black and slave experience.
To what extent? What is that?
To better understand, the modern society that we live in today, and how, you can't look at it you can't look at U.S. history today without understanding that it was built on the back of slaves. Like you can't, because that informs everything that we face today. And, it informs laws about housing. And you can look at the South all the way from the 1920s up till the Civil Rights Movement and look at how that affected law there, looking at segregation laws, looking at how, society was not integrated, especially in the South at that point. And, looking at in a society today where people of a non-white race might not be treated as equitably as white people are, you need to understand where that came from, and being able to look at it from a lens of, understanding systematic racism and understanding slavery of not only African Americans, but indigenous people and of Mexican Americans throughout U.S. history is essential to understanding, where we are today and how we got here. So
the 1619 project wants to just push back the scope a little bit more.
Yeah.
To 1619.
And just basically to take in other voices too. Because, oftentimes, like a lot of us were taught a U.S. history that is like, oh, yay, the colonists came here and they made friends with the Native Americans and they taught them how to grow corn and we had Thanksgiving and then there was a revolution. Like, that's pretty much what you get. But understanding, like, there was this plantation system and there were slaves working and they drove the economy and we killed thousands of Native Americans and brought disease and we pitted tribes against each other and fought, helped them fight and exterminate entire tribes. And so, like, just taking these different elements and realizing that, like, we're not always the heroes of the story. And knowing that, like, history is told by the winners. And
well, that's true for history of everything.
Right? Yeah. And so, being able to take in these multiple perspectives and these different viewpoints and look at everybody's history rather than just like our history I say our as in the sense of, yeah, like I am descended from people that came to Virginia in the 1720s. So, like understanding what took place and understanding that, that this country was built on the struggles of many different people and the subjugation of many different people.
Do you feel like you have some responsibility in some sense, like activist sense, because of that? Or do you?
I don't know. I mean, I just think it's important to present a comprehensive view of history
Mm-hmm.
to people.
Mm-hmm.
Just so that you're getting multiple sides of things and you're understanding what really happened.
Well, I think we can all agree we definitely don't cover enough of
Yeah.
history, period. But with the 1619 project, and I know absolutely nothing about them. I only know that there are a lot of people who say it's complete bullshit,
I mean,
and there are a lot of
and
people
there's
that supported it.
historians that say, even to the very respected historians that say it doesn't necessarily take into account all viewpoints too, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's focused really from looking at the viewpoint of the Black experience coming to the United States, right? And so, taking that as one facet and bringing in other resources as well, I think really creates more of a comprehensive look rather than just like, we're using this and 1619, that's it. Being able to take in all of these different curriculums and different comprehensive, viewpoints is what's essential. So.
What what is the extent of your curriculum, if you don't mind me asking? Like, how deep do you try to go back farther, or do you make an emphasis to try to cover more
I mean,
from that perspective?
Yeah, so really, I mean, they've honestly, like for high school US history, they're like, you remember enough from 8th grade, we're starting at the Civil War, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Wow.
it's, yeah. And you cover like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and then you kind of jump. But what I always start off, I always start the year off with this one article that I just love, by this woman, Angela Condever Wilson, and it's called Educating America, the Historian's Responsibility to Native Americans. And it's really all about why Native American history isn't often included in this early U.S. history because of the way that Native Americans kept their history. Because Native Americans traditionally and culturally have kept history through oral history by telling stories and having designated people within their tribes that are storytellers and are gifted in the art of remembering these stories, practicing them, and telling them and passing them down to different generations. That's how Native Americans kept history. And oftentimes too, their histories are more spiritual. They're less concerned about dates and places like U.S. history is. It's not as chronological. It's more the creation stories that we hear and the stories of events that are passed down. And, academic historians don't necessarily accept those histories because they aren't written down.
Mm-hmm.
And so kind of trying to, create a history when you're not incorporating that oral history and that really important storytelling of tribes, kind of it doesn't create a full view of history, and it creates this very, I'll use the word again, Eurocentric, white European-centric history about our experience with Native Americans, not their experience with us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always start my U.S. history class off every year with that article because, A, it's really important for talking about, what sources do we consider valid? How do we deal with evidence? How do we deal with sources? But it also really addresses why we don't necessarily talk about the Native American experience that much and why Native American history isn't studied as often. And it's often because academic historians don't accept this oral history and don't necessarily, accept these stories because they're more spiritual and they're less chronological and they're not as, fact, date, place as, U.S. history usually is. And so it's a really interesting creation of history because it doesn't necessarily take into account that experience. So how do we create a story that takes into account these experiences and talks about Native American experience if it's not a history that we accept traditionally? So it's about kind of like bridging that gap and being understanding of different cultures and how, we interpret that culture and letting that culture be part of our history as well.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, then how do you fit that into a year or a semester? How do you teach everything that should be taught or everything that should have emphasis put on it? How do you fit all that into
it's
a
hard.
year?
I mean, it's hard, and you just kind of have to, think. I try to, like, for at least every major thing that you study, you know, to kind of take one of those minority viewpoints and be like, well, you know, this is the history that is in the curriculum and that we're normally taught, but also like, let's look at this experience and see how it lines up with this. And, you know, that's really the part about working with sources, is to be able to say, this person said this person said this, let's bridge these together and look how we can make a whole comprehensive story. And that's a lot of what history is. So academic history, at least like historians writing history.
What is accepted.
Yeah.
Yeah.